Drug overdoses kill more Americans than car accidents or gun violence. And a new report out today highlights this growing, really metastasizing problem. 12.5 million Americans abused prescription painkillers last year. This according to the Surgeon General's first report dedicated to addiction. And 78 Americans die every day from opioid overdoses. Acting Administrator of the DEA, Chuck Rosenberg, has referred to the opioid epidemic as unprecedented and horrific and is here with me to discuss it now. You have said quite simply that there needs to be a collective wake-up.
There needs to be a huge wake-up.
What is it that you're talking about?
I'm talking about a bunch of different things. And by the way, the problem is not just opioids and heroin, although let's focus on that today. You're right, 78 people will die today of opioids and heroin overdoses. 130 people will die today from a drug overdose. We have a massive problem on our hands. And so we have to think about solving it in a bunch of different ways. But Josh, what I've said over and over is we're not going to enforce or prosecute or jail our way out of this mess. That's a part of it, but that's not all of it.
We see and we hear talk of bridges from one drug to the next. And when we hear opioids, I know people might think synthetics, people might think things like heroin, but it begins so often with prescription medication. How to get a handle on this?
It sure does. We know that 4 out of 5 new heroin users started on pills. And if you get addicted to pills, and that can happen pretty fast, right? Maybe a little bit different for you or me or somebody else, but if you get addicted to pills, sustaining that habit on the street gets crazy expensive. Heroin is more plentiful and cheaper. And so we see both a causative and correlative relationship, people moving from prescription pill addictions to heroin.
Listening to the Surgeon General today on National Public Radio, he said that there are whole states where there are more opioid prescriptions, painkiller prescriptions, than there are residents of the state. Some 21 million Americans have substance abuse disorders. And I do want to ask you, a Senate Judiciary hearing in July, Senator Richard Durbin accused the DEA of flooding America with more opioid pills than is medically necessary.
I was there. I remember that.
14 billion pills are said to have been dispensed in 2014.
But I met with Senator Durbin afterwards and a number of his colleagues. We sat down for about an hour and pushed back because I don't think those numbers were exactly right. It's sort of complicated, and I'm happy to explain it if you want, but I can also simplify it. We don't regulate the practice of medicine at the DEA, nor do I think you would want us to. So when manufacturers ask for the capacity to produce stuff legally, legitimately, we make sure that they have the capacity to do it. What happens after that is also part of the problem. So yeah, lots of pills, lots of prescriptions, lots of people getting addicted, but I'm not sure you want the DEA regulating the practice of medicine.
But you can look at that, it seems, through a slightly different lens and hear supply and demand.
Right. Well, we have cut what we call the production quota. We just made a 25% reduction in it, in part in response to Senator Durbin's criticism. And as I told him that day, and I'll tell you today, yeah, we can do better on our end, absolutely. But again, I don't think you want us regulating the practice of medicine. A life-saving drug, naloxone, credited with saving thousands of lives. Overdose victims essentially are revived by it. Critics will say that opioid users, knowing essentially that there's a lifeline out there, will continue use because they essentially believe they can be brought back. What do you say to that? Look, if we're saving lives, that's a good thing, right? In fact, we've trained hundreds of DEA personnel on the administration of naloxone. Not because we're first responders, because typically we're not, right? Cops and paramedics are your typical first responders. But what I worry about running this great agency are our men and women running into opioids, fentanyl, which can be lethal to the touch. And I want our folks to be able to help
each other,
And
should there be an incidental or accidental exposure.
And isn't that the problem here? It seems, again, once you delve into the opioid crisis, you're almost talking about a war on too many fronts. Because you mentioned first responders, you mentioned fentanyl, other synthetics, fentanyl 30 to 50 times more potent than heroin.
That's
and
right.
that a first responder can arrive to an overdose, a scene of an overdose, and have no idea how to specifically treat the victim because they simply have no idea what it is they've overdosed on.
Well, but they may know it's an opioid, and so naloxone is going to help. And back to your original question, is this a good thing or a bad thing? It's a good thing. If we're saving lives with naloxone, it's a good thing. And I reject the argument that we ought to stop doing that. That sounds crazy to me. Even if we end up administering it 2 or 3 or 7 times to the same person, we're still saving lives. Isn't that worth it?
Saving lives is completely worth it.
It's worth it, right?
I'm compelled to ask you about this. I know you've said that using marijuana as medicine, you've described that essentially as a joke. A 2014 study found that states, though, where medical marijuana is legal, overdose deaths dropped by some 25%. So I guess to ask you, isn't it worth it if the numbers suggest that it is?
I'm going to answer your question in a slightly different way.
Okay.
We're bound by statute to accept the FDA's determination on the medical efficacy of marijuana. So if the FDA, and they got a bunch of really smart scientists and doctors, say it's not a medicine, right? Then by statute, we accept that determination, and it stays in Schedule 1. If Congress comes along and changes the law, we follow the new law. So I hate to oversimplify this thing, but I think we would rather have the men and women of the FDA making scientific determinations than anyone else.
But there is research published last year in the Drug and Alcohol Review, a journal, found that 80% of medical marijuana users say they would substitute marijuana for painkillers. Again, that seems to be attacking the problem at the root.
Yeah,
I mean, what was the number just before we began? 5% of the world's population?
And in one way or another, yes, 5% of the world's population.
Here in the United States.
Here in the United States. And in some form or another, we consume 99% of the world's hydrocodone.
So if there's a way essentially to wean ourselves collectively from hydrocodone use, and one way is medical marijuana, isn't it worth pursuing?
I think there are other and better ways, right? So we do it sort of in 2 buckets. We have the traditional law enforcement supply side, goal of thwarting the dangerous cartels and the violent street gangs. We call that intersection sort of the unholy alliance. And we do a lot of demand reduction. So we try to educate and treat and rehabilitate. For instance, we produced with the FBI a really good movie about opioid addiction called Chasing the Dragon. Watch it with your kids. Watch it first without your kids because the language is a little rough. Then watch it with your kids and have that conversation. We have partnered with Discovery Education to create a STEM-based curricula that we can drop into any middle or high school in America for free, with toolkits for parents and teachers and for kids.
Important stuff.
It's important stuff. So look, you and I might disagree over the efficacy of medical marijuana. I accept the FDA's determination that it's not a medicine. They're a lot smarter than I am. But we will continue to attack it from supply and from demand sides.
Well, the numbers really speak to just how serious this is a looming humanitarian crisis, simply in this
It's a public health crisis, and like I said, we're not going to enforce or prosecute our way out of it. That's a part of it. That is not the whole solution, Josh.
Acting Chief of the DEA, Chuck Rosenberg.
Thank you
very much. Appreciate the time today.
You
Thank
bet.
you.